Hey guys, welcome back to another one of my horse racing decade videos. Now, if you remember last time I made a video about my 5 favorite races of the decade, so now it's time for my 5 least favorite races of the decade, because as you know, this decade was far from a perfect decade for horse racing, and there were a couple pretty bad duds, especially towards the end. So, I'll be going over my 5 least favorite races, based off my personal experiences with these races, so without further ado, let's go into it. So at number 5, I have the 2018 Cotillion Stakes, and this one is very simply just because of how poorly managed the Stewart's Inquiry was. Now, if you don't know, in the race, Monomoy Girl defeats Midnight Bisou in the Cotillion Stakes. However, there was a Stewart's Inquiry because Monomoy Girl drifted out slightly. And at the very end, it was decided that Monomoy Girl would be disqualified. This became a very controversial and hypocritical choice, as in the previous weeks, Abel Tasman had very severely bumped into a late in the Personal Ensign Stakes, however faced no such takedown. So it was very much a very poorly managed call to have Monomoy Girl be disqualified, but not Abel Tasman. So it really just put the Stewarts in a really bad light, because it showed a lot of blatant hypocrisy and some pretty different standards when it came to the stewards, and it just kind of makes you wonder, shouldn't the stewards be consistent state by state, and shouldn't there, be some set rules for every single state, rather than some rules that change for every single state? It just doesn't work like that now. So I just thought that choice to disqualify Monomoy Girl was completely uncalled for, and it just makes my blood boil.
Monomoy Girl, break out the crowd.
At number 4, we have the 2019 Kentucky Derby. Now, this race mainly gets on here not because I think the disqualification was uncalled for, but just because of how toxic the arguments are. Because of how big the Kentucky Derby is, a lot more people are going to be watching the race, and honestly, I'm just going to say it right here, a lot of people who don't know anything about horse racing are going to be talking about this. There are many people who don't even know that horses can be disqualified in races. And especially like celebrities like Donald Trump trying to say that they know something about horse racing when all they've really watched is the Kentucky Derby. I'm sorry, but no matter what your political beliefs are, I doubt that Donald Trump's a horse racing expert. But I think I'm getting a little off track here. Bottom line is that whenever this race is brought up, all it causes is a bunch of annoying, toxic arguments that never get anywhere, and because of that, I look on this Kentucky Derby not very fondly, just because of how annoying it is, just seeing people constantly being like, that disqualification was unjustified, we love you, Maximum Security, you're the real winner! Yeah, guess what, this is the steward's call, and honestly, I think it was a pretty justified one. When you hinder plenty of horses all at once, and especially horses like Bodie Express, who very, very abruptly pulled up because of him, you're going to get taken down. No questions asked.
Will is second, Long Range Toddy third, and 4 wide and moving up is Country House's Bodie Express plummets through the field.
At number 3, we have the 2010 Breeders' Cup Classic. Now, when I was 6, I was told by my elementary school nurse about Zenyatta, and I got really excited. The idea of a horse who was a perfect 19 for 19 and about to go a perfect 20 for 20. It stuck. I really wanted to see that happen. So, I decided to turn on the television and watch the Breeders' Cup Classic after previously watching the Breeders' Cup Marathon, which I've already mentioned is one of my favorite races. But what I watched was absolutely heartbreaking, as I came in with the expectations that I was about to see an undefeated champion horse win for one last time. But what I got was seeing a winning streak be snapped by the closest of margins at the absolute worst of times. It just crushed me, as I am, as mentioned before, a lover of winning streaks. So seeing one be set up so perfectly to success, and then just be crushed by the smallest of margins, it broke my heart. It was absolutely terrible. I just remember being super sad about the whole thing. Just getting ready to see Zenyatta, and then to see her lose the first time I ever watched her. And honestly, that race has really soured my opinion of Zenyatta, because that's the only real memory I have of her, watching her lose when she needed to win the most. At number 2, we have the 2014 Melbourne Cup. Now, this was the first Melbourne Cup that I actually anticipated watching. Previously, I'd only really seen clips of the Melbourne Cup from, YouTube and all that, but this was the first one that I actually anticipated and couldn't wait to watch. So, when I watched it, I was absolutely crushed to hear that 2 horses were killed in the race. It just really, really sucked, especially with the favorite, Admire Rachdi, being one of the victims. It was just terrible, and it gave me a terrible first impression of what the Melbourne Cup was like. And honestly, that first impression turned out to be a generally correct statement that the Melbourne Cup is a killer race, especially with at least one horse being killed every Melbourne Cup since then. Correct me if I'm wrong, but I think it's about that. At least 6 horses, I believe, have been killed since the 2014 running. And honestly, it really sucks, as a lover of horse racing, just to know how deadly some of the races can get, and how it's even worse because the horses don't really have any options on if they can run or not, especially Admire Rachdi, and that ended up killing him. It just sucks. It really just sucks. It was just a terrible race. I don't even remember, the winner in Protectionist. All I remember from him was that he ran in a race that killed 2 horses, and that's just a terrible thing to remember a race by. And that's why it gets so high on the list. And at number 1, it's the 2019 Breeders' Cup Classic. This race needs no introduction. It was a race that happened at the absolute worst time, having Santa Anita host the Breeders' Cup after such an infamous year, killing over 40 horses in just 1 year, and having literally everyone watching the race carefully, ready to just call out Santa Anita as a horse gets killed on the Breeders' Cup day. And I was just thinking that maybe, just maybe, we'd hang on just for one more race. And then, boom, in the home stretch, Mongolian Groom breaks down and dies. And in my mind, I was like, I knew it. I knew this was probably going to happen. Especially since me and plenty of people had made videos talking about how hosting the Breeders' Cup at the Santa Anita racetrack was a horrible idea. And I get it, they probably couldn't reschedule and relocate the track in time. But you know what? It was still a terrible idea, and it blew up in their face. Everyone was watching the Breeders' Cup that day, and everyone watched as Mongolian Groom died. It was just a horrible time to watch horse racing, and the entire year of 2019 had already been a terrible year for horse racing and had already soured their reputation severely in the general public. And this was just the icing on the frickin' cake. One of the biggest races of the year just kills a horse in front of everybody. This is worse than having a controversial disqualification. Way worse. It's just terrible. And it was an absolutely terrible way to end the decade, with a Breeders' Cup that kills a horse on a very infamous track. Santa Anita's reputation is now absolutely ruined, and now horse racing as a whole has just been soured by everyone watching as a horse dies. It's going to take a lot to recover from this, and I don't know if we even can. And that's why I consider this the worst race of the decade. Hopefully next decade, we get something better. See you guys next time.